Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, bringing you the latest in my weekly series, which is called The War on Misinformation, where I attempt to address some of the erroneous and inaccurate reporting by mainstream media about issues relating to the housing market. And this week I want to refer to some research that I did a year or so ago, where I looked at what had been predicted in mainstream media for the housing markets of Australia. I went back to the start of the century, in fact, so over 15 years of research to look at what the headlines have been saying in terms of prediction, what's going to happen to real estate markets, what's going to happen to prices, and comparing with the actual outcomes. And it's very relevant to the current situation, because we have increasingly very, very negative media headlines in terms of what's happening with property markets in Australia right now and what's going to happen. A lot of it very over the top, wildly inaccurate, and in some cases extremely unreasonable. So it's good to refer to this list that I have in front of me. I call it my top 20 worst predictions for Australian real estate. This is the outcome of the research exercise I did, where I looked at what's been predicted since the year 2000 and what the actual outcomes had been. And what this revealed is that those kind of doomsday predictions about Australian property prices have been extremely common, remarkably common in fact, over the last 15 or so years. And they've all been absolutely and spectacularly wrong. So here's some examples. There's a lot of the people who make these predictions are overseas spookers who come to Australia to promote a new book or to do a seminar tour, and they're hoping to get lots of people coming to their seminars and earning, hoping to earn millions of dollars from running their seminars. And to attract publicity and to drum up bums on seats, they figure that the easiest way to do that is to say something spectacularly negative about the local housing market. Of course, they're right. Media just laps this sort of stuff up very, very easily. It's such easy sensationalist headlines, and that's what they're looking for. So a spruiker I'm sure you haven't heard of, I certainly hadn't heard of him until he came to Australia in 2012, called Jordan Worth. And he predicted that Australian home values right across the country were going to fall 60% in a bloodbath in 2013. And he said that land values were going to fall 90%. Can you imagine that? 90% fall in our land values means that our land was going to be practically worthless. They didn't explain why. I don't think he actually believed what he was saying. It was simply a play for publicity, and he did. He got lots of free publicity, but of course, he was utterly and spectacularly wrong. He predicted a bloodbath in 2013, and what actually happened was, on average, according to the research, Australian capital city house prices rose 9% in 2013 and a further 8% in 2014. And in the major cities, they continued to grow at even higher rates following that. So that particular forecast was utterly wrong. It was always going to be, of course, but media gave it lots of credibility at the time. Now, there's another US spruiker who loves to make doomsday predictions. He does it all around the world. That's how he makes his living, writes books of this sort. That's Harry S. Dent. And he's been to Australia 3 times that I'm aware of in the last 7 or so years. The first time was in 2011. And in 2011, when he came, he predicted that Australian real estate prices were going to fall 40% in 2012. And he advised Australians to sell all their real estate, get out while they can. And that got masses of publicity around the country. And of course, that was spectacularly wrong as well. On average, city prices rose, not much, but they did rise in 2012. And then they rose, according to the research, about 9% in 2013 on average. And as we know, from that point onwards, we had a significant property boom with prices rising in double digits each year in Sydney and Melbourne, though not generally across Australia. But the predicted fall of 40% in 2012 obviously didn't happen. Well, Harry S. Dent came back in 2014 and hell, he made the same prediction all over again. He said prices are going to crash sometime in 2014, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Well, we know how wrong he got that. Well, he was actually back again last year, and he's back again now, and he's still making the same predictions. Always time specific. That's the point. These predictions are all time specific. They say in the next 12 months or next year, so we know whether they're right or not. In Morgan Stanley's Gerard Minack in 2010 declared that the Australian market was about 40% overvalued and the bubble was about to burst. And of course, we know that on average, capital city prices have been rising steadily since then. There was the famous instance where Steve Keen, an economist at that time was an economist at the University of Western Sydney, made the prediction that Australian house prices were going to fall 40% in 2009. And according to the ABS, in 2009, Australian prices on average rose 13.6%, or RP data says they rose an average of 11.5%. So Steve Keen was horribly wrong. He still continues to be given credibility. He's been making those sorts of predictions ever since. He's been wrong year after year after year, but he's still getting plenty of airplay in Australian media because they like anyone who's willing to stand up and say things like that. Doesn't matter how many times they've been wrong in the past. Credibility doesn't seem to be a necessary prerequisite for getting airtime on television or in media generally. He made a further major prediction in 2013, talking about prices falling 20% or more. That prediction was made in 2011. He said prices will fall by 20% or more by 2013. And again, the opposite happened in the major markets of Australia. Here's someone called Chris Sace on Money Morning in March 2011. He said that the value of your home could fall 60% as soon as interest rates start rising. And of course, we're still waiting for that collapse to happen. 60%. I mean, it's never happened in the history of the world, not just in Australia, but nowhere in the world have we had a collapse in prices anywhere near that high, even post-GFC, where there were a small number of countries which were afflicted by recessions and high unemployment and major oversupplies of real estate, where there was substantial decline in property values, but nothing remotely close to the sorts of predictions that have been made here. Another US spooker came to Australia in 2010, Jeremy Grantham, and said the Australian housing bubble is about to burst. Sell your real estate. He said, well, capital city prices rose in 2012, 2013, 2014, and have kept on going. On average, I'm talking about the average across the capital cities. It's primarily been a Sydney and Melbourne phenomenon, but we certainly haven't seen collapse of property values in any of our major markets in any of these timeframes that have been predicted. I mean, there's a whole series of similar forecasts been made. Here was an economist from Investex in 2012 saying that Australian housing prices will fall by up to 20% by the end of 2014. And of course, we know that of course didn't happen. Led by Sydney and Melbourne, the average has been a substantial rise during the years for which that forecast was made, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are many other similar instances. The common denominator of all these sort of extreme predictions is that they're either spruikers seeking to achieve publicity for themselves to further their business, or when they're embarking on a seminar tour or book launch, or they're economists who don't get real estate and they generalise about what they call the Australian property market. And we're seeing that right now. We're seeing a lot of economists saying we think Australian property prices are going to fall 5% next year, or whatever their prediction happens to be. None of the predictions we're getting at the moment are as extremes as these ones that I've highlighted from the last, say, 10 or 15 years. But most of the predictions are for Australian property prices are going to fall. Now, what they really mean, although they probably don't realise it, is that they're talking primarily about Sydney and to a lesser extent Melbourne, and they're just extrapolating that across the whole country. Well, the whole country isn't doing what's happening in Sydney and Melbourne. simply isn't. Our smaller capital cities don't have price decline, apart from Darwin, which is a special case. We have some strongly rising markets in some of our smaller cities, led by Hobart, and also the top end of the property markets in Perth, Canberra and Adelaide have all been rising in double digits in the last 12 months. And then we've got regional Australia, which tends to be completely overlooked by everybody. The strongest markets in Australia right now are actually in regional markets, including in Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, and we're starting to see some rising markets now also in Queensland. So the problem is generalisation. I talked about that in last week's War on Misinformation broadcast at this time, and it continues to be a problem. Economists just can't seem to find a way to talk about real estate except as a single market. They talk about it because we've got one stock market. They think that we also have one property market, and obviously we don't. And so it's extremely ignorant to talk about the Australian property market or the Australian property prices are going to fall by X% when we have markets where right now prices are rising in double digits and in some case by more than 20%. Just to finish off this particular broadcast, I refer you to an article that I saw today, and it said Sydney's real estate boom has priced first home buyers out of the market. Sound familiar? Yeah, except that this article was a newspaper article from 1988, and very, very similar to the tone of articles we're seeing today, where they talked about first home buyers just can't possibly hope to buy, completely priced out of the market, doomed to a lifetime of renting. And then they list prices in suburbs like Vaucluse and Bronte and Paddington and Bellevue Hill, the real upmarket suburbs, the most expensive ones, has evidence that first home buyers were priced out of the market. At that time, our prices out around places like Liverpool and Blacktown, out in the west and southwest, where first home buyers are more likely to be buying, median house prices were well under 100,000 at that time. But it's interesting that pretty much nothing has changed in this debate. That was 30 years ago, and we're still having the same debate now. Nothing has changed. The standard of debate is no better, and the outcomes are no better. And why not? Well, because the media debate about this is just so poor. We're not addressing any of the real issues that are causing affordability problems in some parts of Australia, particularly the high cost of creating new dwellings. That's the nub of the issue. The zoning system's also got a lot to do with it. It mitigates against density. There's a big movement in the major cities of Australia against town housing unit development. People don't want it in their leafy suburbs, so they're forcing all the new development out to the fringes, and it's very expensive to develop out there, and you've got to spend big on infrastructure because no infrastructure exists in some of these places, and that's all charged to the developer, which adds to the cost of creating new housing, so the end price is ridiculously high. So yeah, lots of doomsday headlines of that sort. They've been common for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and basically what they all have in common is that they've all been wrong. And the current predictions that we're seeing quite commonly in media at the moment, with major decline, collapse in prices predicted by some extreme elements, although they're all going to be proven wrong too, I'm quite sure. It's interesting to note that through the research that we do every day, we're aware that most commentators, most credible organisations who are commenting on the Australian housing market are actually predicting very, very moderate outcomes. In the major markets like Sydney and Melbourne, they see prices declining, but a very, what they call an orderly wind down of the previous boom, and they're not expecting anything dramatic to happen. But you're not actually reading about that in our newspapers and other forms of media because they're only interested in the relatively small number of people willing to make the doomsday predictions. They're the ones that are appearing on the front page, and the rational, calm, reasoned analysis of which is coming from most commentators is just not getting any airplay in media. That's it. Let's do it again next week. We'll talk about some of the other issues which come under the general heading of my war on misinformation. Talk to you then.